Hello, I'm Andrew Mazzone, President of the Henry George School of Social Science. Welcome to Smart Talk. On this program, we discuss and debate controversial topics with leading economists and social scientists from around the world. Our conversations are always thought-provoking and timely. Today's guest, joining us via Skype, is Scott Baker. Scott is President of Common Ground NYC, a Georgist group focused on achieving social justice and economic growth through a policy of land taxation. He is also the senior economic editor of Op-Ed News, a top 100 blog. Scott, welcome to Smart Talk. So Scott, anyway, I wanted you to explain to the viewers what a modern-day Georgist thinks and how you look at the economy, some of the problems you think are worth really dealing with in depth, and we'll take it from there. We'll just continue based off your generalized introduction of Georgism, and then we'll go from there. So why don't you start with why you're a Georgist and what George would do today if he were around?
Well, I was looking around like a lot of people for what the cause of poverty and massive inequality is, because, of course, like in George's day, I realized that there's a wide gap, even though there's been so much progress. And Henry George realized this long ago in the 19th century, that even though you have tremendous technological progress, there's still a tremendous disparity in wealth, and there's so many people at the bottom, at even below subsistence level. So, you know, I've been thinking about this. What would Henry George do today if he was somehow brought back at the moment of his death? He was put into stasis, and then he was somehow brought back having lived his life in the 19th century. And he looked around and he saw all of these taller buildings and these great new technological wonders and airplanes overhead. Once he got over all of that, what would he think of the world? Well, you know, I think he would see pretty quickly, because he was a curious guy, that really things have not changed that much. And in fact, there's more mechanisms, if you will, for promoting inequality, for keeping people unequal, and for keeping poverty going as a policy, basically. And so basically you've got a situation where people who are in possession of land, and by land I mean all of natural resources, including location, are able to monopolize that, and they're able to extract the rent out of everybody else for the use of that land, because, as Henry George realized most eloquently, anybody who controls the land, who owns the land, can basically extract whatever he wants, because none of us can live without land. It's indispensable to the human condition.
Well, let me just interject right there. I mean, I'm an IBM factory, and I'm occupying land upstate. And all of a sudden, I decide to move to China. So they're not holding a monopoly position in that sense. So how would you explain Henry George in a world of free trade, mobility of factors of production, and so on? I'm being the devil's advocate.
Yeah. Well, you see, a couple of things come up. First of all, you know, you have a transportation cost, and the transportation is actually over land. The ocean is land. The ports are land. Roads are land, getting from the port back to the markets that you want to serve. Now, if we don't charge, if we don't collect the rent, I shouldn't say charge, if we don't take the market price of that land and collect it back into the local governments, then in effect we're subsidizing these international companies. So, as I wrote in one of my articles, you know, we have all kinds of subsidies for these huge conglomerate industrial companies that really have no national base. They're really worldwide. So that we actually are encouraging them to go overseas to produce overseas, and we're not collecting the rent when they come back.
Well, that's the point. I mean, they build up here. They use the infrastructure, the educational facilities, and all of that, the freedom, the rule of law that makes it stable here. They use all that, and then they can simply uplift, run to an area that environmentally isn't the best, where labor has no protection, and they can reap a surplus for the time being until that catches up with them there. So the simple thing would be to say, they're taking part of the land commons from here, over there, we tax them with the product when it comes back here, and in effect that would eliminate that kind of problem. Or China would do the same thing. China would tax its land rents, and then essentially you'd have a quid pro quo. Now, Henry George actually believed that there wasn't that much difference between people and nations around the world, so this IBM runaway problem would not have been paramount in his mind. Your comments on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, he was coming from a point of view where basically people have opportunity, and if they have equal opportunity, basically they're all going to even out on a national scale. Of course, individuals vary, but on a national scale, they'll all even out. So he would realize right away that you know, the Chinese are just as smart and clever and hardworking as the Americans. They can produce whatever we can produce, but the real difference is the natural advantages. We're having a condition in America that we don't have in China, and unless we put some kind of a fee on that when we import the goods from China to compensate and maybe actually to encourage them to meet our standards, then we're actually penalizing our own workers.
Of course, the interesting question is, why wouldn't we have done that? And that's probably another topic. If I'm an investment banker from New York, that's the last thing I want. I mean,
well,
because because I'm getting a nice little premium running back and forth and pushing labor all around the world down, and I reap that premium. I'm good with that as an investment banker.
Well, you're good with that, and the politicians who campaign you finance are good with that. And this is where the circle is. You know, this is the vicious circle, where politicians are getting their money from the people who, you know, the companies that are going overseas, who are making profits overseas. They plow a little bit back to our politicians here to keep that game going and to keep those laws in place that let them get a free ride, basically. So now this comes to another part of our discussion, perhaps, which involves public campaign financing, but not in the sense that people usually think, but in the sense that money itself is another monopoly.
Why don't you explain how we, as up-to-date Georgians, would look at money as a very powerful monopoly class?
So what we say, and as a matter of fact, what Henry George said himself, is that money is too important to be left exclusively to the banks to create. Now we can have a little argument about the percentage of private creation versus public creation by the government, but clearly in George's time they had something called the Lincoln Greenback, which was public money. It was money that was created during the Civil War, first created in 3 series during the Legal Tender Acts in 1862 through 1863. And it constituted 40% of the federal budget at that time during the war. Actually, the banks wanted 24 to 36% interest. So this kind of money, which was United States notes, continued. As a matter of fact, I have a sample here. This is from 1928, this one on the top.
What's it worth? It's worth about $5 today, correct?
Well, actually, it's worth more because you buy this on eBay as a collector's item, and you pay about twice face value. So these United States notes, which are not Federal Reserve notes, these have actually held their value better than Federal Reserve notes. So you get about twice that on eBay for selling them. And you can see there's a red seal there, and there's no bank issuing this because it came directly out of Treasury. So this is 100% debt-free money.
Why don't you explain, because I think most of the American people would not understand or be cognizant of this difference. Explain the difference between the two sources of money. I think this is a key point.
Okay, well, basically what most of our money is, 97%, is issued by commercial banks privately. And so when they make loans, they create money in the process of making loans. Now, in a sense, the government is actually indebted to these banks and other institutions as well, because Treasury issues treasuries, and in exchange for that gets dollars, or at least electronic notations of dollars in the computer. So in order to get more money that we don't raise in taxes into the government accounts, the government has to issue treasuries, which are bought by the central bank and by others. Actually, our central bank only owns 18% of the treasuries. So it's mostly foreign buyers and institutional buyers that buy up treasuries, and that in turn keeps our money supply going. but it does it at a cost. You know, there's an interest cost, so we have to pay the interest. I mean, we, the American people, have to pay the interest to these buyers, these institutional buyers of our dollars, so that you know, first of all, there's a permanent drain on our treasury going to foreign countries such as China, which we just talked about, which is the second largest holder of these treasuries, Japan being the first. And that allows them to get an interest stream, which is several $billions a year. And so therefore, they don't have to raise that money themselves, which means that they don't have to tax their own citizenry. So in effect, our treasuries are subsidizing their low taxation and therefore their low prices on their goods. But the worst part of it is actually it weakens their currency with respect to ours. So that, in other words, if they buy a lot of dollars, their dollars become in shorter supply over here, so each dollar becomes more precious. And it takes, they put the yuan in, which means that they have to produce more yuan. So they have more yuan coming over here, so it weakens their currency and it strengthens ours when they buy treasuries. So this, in effect, makes their currency weaker.
It makes their exports cheaper, and of course, it makes it harder for us to compete on a fair basis. But also, when we create money that way, there's no guarantee that that money will be directed into infrastructure or useful projects. That money can be directed overseas very easily, and as the current situation demonstrates, the quantitative easing, where that money has basically stayed with the banks because they say there's no investment opportunity in America, and it ends up in the securities markets trading back and forth, making an enormous amount of commissions for the bankers and the hedge funds connected with that, and essentially the remaining American industry and public basically suffer greatly because of that. Now, the greenbacks would have a different effect. If I recall correctly, Lincoln's financed the Civil War by direct issuance of currency. So he bought all his military supplies. And not only that, he supplied currency to industry, because at the end of the Civil War, the United States had 3 times the industry that it had at the start. It financed a massive military campaign for 4 years. And when the Civil War was over, the United States exploded into becoming the most dominant power in the world 20 years later. So greenbacking or direct issuance, directed correctly, and especially in the national interest, has tremendous power. We've lost that today. Any comments?
Yeah, I mean, I would only add to that, you know, Lincoln was actually an infrastructure builder. He helped the railroads connect across country at the same time the Civil War was running. People tend to forget that because the war was going on. But he was like FDR. He was doing massive infrastructure projects. And so this was money directly put into the economy, in the real economy.
Of course, he subsidized all the robber barons building the railroad. So, I mean, that's the negative. So you'd have to say,
that's true.
I mean, it became a real potboiler in terms of grabbing concessions. I guess he would have argued that it was worth the price to industrialize with the freebooters, but he didn't recapture that money that was created in effect from the colonies.
This was the issue. He didn't capture the money, or rather the localities perhaps didn't capture the land value tax, which of course is what Henry George is mainly known for. So we say, you know, okay, you can issue money into the economy directly, but in order to prevent that rent seeking, which is going to enrich the 1% or 1% of that time, we should have recaptured that money, basically the land monopoly of the railroads, for example. We basically gave away the land. We had this checkerboard policy where we would give them an acre for every acre they bought. And so we were giving away vast amounts of land to these railroad magnates. And they, of course, would own that, and then people would build along the rail lines and make a lot of money and not pay the increased value of those locations back to the government. So the government was, in effect, subsidizing those fortunes either by local people buying property or the railroad selling off the property to people so that they could make a profit on that along the way.
Well, they would argue. Now, let me take a little different viewpoint on that. I mean, you could argue that the fact we had an open frontier and we had unlimited land, at least for a while, relieved the pressure of land monopoly, because essentially you could continue to move west, move west, move west, and in effect bypass wherever the land monopoly might really bite. But of course there's a limit to that, and of course the limit was reached in Henry George's time. By 1890, all of the good, quote, good farmland was taken up, and a lot of the good city land. And then the law of rent really started to bite. But as long as the United States had open frontiers, even if it gave away select pieces of land for future building of railroads, there was enough give in the system and enough openness in the system so that land rents didn't bite to the point of demoralizing the American people. And if you look at the history of America, if you look at 200 years of history up until, let's say, the 1970s, you could say that open frontiers allowed or prevented rent gouging up until the 1890s. And then, of course, we were fortunate enough to be the active seller of war merchandise in 2 world wars, which in effect created a synthetic open frontier twice. So the American people, the American worker, were beneficiaries of things that Piketty is now documenting, some anomalies that allowed America and American citizens to have quite the life up until 1970, before land rents really start to bite. Your comments?
Yeah, well, I finished Thomas Piketty's book recently too, and the Georgist consensus, not just among me, but among people like Mason Gaffney and so forth who review it, is that Piketty confuses land rent with capital. He conflates the two, which a lot of neo-economists, neo-modern economists do, as opposed to the classical economists like Henry George, who separated land and capital into 2 distinct categories. So when you do that, then you don't recognize the rent on the land as something distinct from capital. You really can't have an economic science, because the land is created by nature. It appreciates in value because of population pressure. It's finite. It can't be moved. You know, capital is basically the opposite of all of that. You can move capital anywhere in the world. It's man-made. It depreciates because it wears out. It becomes obsolete. So if you conflate the two, you really have a confused field of study.
Well, he would have argued, to be fair to Piketty, that he couldn't disaggregate it. The GNP accounts don't make that an easy thing to do. So he's essentially saying, look, I can associate great wealth increases with bad income distributions. And on that basis, by taking a massive amount of data for 200 years, he kind of makes the point that there's something inexorable about the system that creates this. And I think that's what makes his impact. You can't argue with the statistics. Of course, his solution can't be implemented for the very point you make. He's going to be taxing the wrong thing to try to correct that.
Right. He's taxing the wrong thing, and he's not recognizing why what his version of capital is appreciates so much more than the growth of the nation that produces it. You know, he's got this formula: R is greater than G, where R is the rate of capital growth, and G is the rate of the growth of the country or the community, maybe. So that R is always greater than G because, according to him, capital appreciates faster. Well, if you include rent among the things within capital, that's true. We would argue that if you disaggregate the rent, and we would argue you can do that, that you can actually capture that rent back, and then you'll have a more equilibrium type of formula where our true capital is pretty much equal to the rate of the growth of the country.
Without financialization, without loaning on real capital, you know, with unlimited money and unlimited money creation, R could never exceed G for any continued length of time. So, I mean, that's really the bottom line. The real bottom line here is that once you create a land monopoly or other monopolies, but land is kind of the big one, or natural resources, oil, and you can start lending money on that, and you can start speculating on it, and you can start bidding on it, the nominal wealth of everybody rises tremendously. And if governments, in effect, push interest rates down as low as they can, well, this capital will just explode in terms of nominal value, not necessarily real value, but it's nominal because if you sell it, you can spend it, you can take the money, and you can essentially run somewhere and perhaps buy real capital. So there's an argument about Piketty in the sense that he demonstrated what people intuitively know. There's a tremendous maladjustment of income, and it seems to be systemic. Has he proven why that's so, and has he come up with an answer of what to do about it? I don't think so. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, he wants basically a wealth tax, and it's a tax not only on income but on imputed income, so that if somebody holds stock or if they hold land, he would tax it even while they're holding it, not just upon the sale. So this is a very difficult thing to do, and even he admits, you know, to figure out what people own and hold all over the world, and it would have to be worldwide because otherwise people would escape the tax. To do that is virtually impossible. The records are a little better now than when, you know, historically he was collecting. It goes back 200 years or so, but they're not that good. And besides, the temptation for the Cayman Islands or Switzerland or whatever to not have that kind of tax would be overwhelming. It's already high, but if you had, for example, an optimistic situation where you had the big countries like America and Japan and most of Europe actually imposing such a tax, the money would flee like mad to any of these smaller regions that didn't have such a tax. Already, according to the Tax Justice Network, $32 trillion is invested in offshore accounts by actually the 1% of the 1%, not even the 1%.
Let's talk about the amount of monopoly rent. We'll generalize land rent into land rent, resource rent, and to a certain extent, a rent on the commons. For example, you could explain a Microsoft Commons, let's say, or a Google Commons, yeah, where just by the nature of network effects, it reaches a critical mass, and then everybody has to use their formulation simply because it becomes a massive thing and it doesn't pay to do anything else. But we'll leave that out. We'll just talk about land and resource rents. A number of Georgists have done studies just in the United States to identify just how much money are we talking about. What percentage of the GNP are we talking about here? Are we talking about 2%, 1%?
Well, it's far more than that, because if you look at Nick Tiedemann or Mason Gaffney, they're saying more than 1/3 of the GDP is actually in some sort of economic rent. There's a video on Op-Ed News, which I put up there with Fred Harrison, where they talk about $5.3 trillion of economic rent, which is obviously more than 1/3 of our $17 trillion GDP. Now it's not all in obvious places. I mean, some of it may be in radio spectrum and airplane slots and, you know, congestion in the cities and so forth. But the point is, we're not collecting that. If we did collect that, which is collected privately anyway, it wouldn't hurt the economy. And in fact, it would allow us to untax actual production in terms of wages and true capital, sales, that kind of thing. And so therefore, people would have more incentive to work. They would have more opportunity to buy. They wouldn't be penalized for commerce. So you would have a greater velocity of money, and you would have greater opportunity for people to earn money. And so if we collected this rent, which is now privatized, and put it in the public purse, we would also have an opportunity for a citizen's dividend, which is actually just because it's actually our collective demand for these things in the commons, including land, that drives the price up in the first place. This is an important point that people really have to understand. If you build a skyscraper in the middle of New York City, the value of that skyscraper is because of the location. And if you move that location from the middle of New York City to the middle of New York State, well, it's basically worthless at that point, because you have no infrastructure, you have no population. There's no point in doing that, but it just goes to show how valuable the location is. And this is not something the developer has created. This is something that they took advantage of.
Well, I could argue the other way. There was a great land tax capture maybe 50 years ago, Joseph Stalin was collecting all the land rents in the Soviet Union, and it didn't turn out so well. Do you have any comments about that? I mean, that's a good argument. Why would a libertarian would say, okay, we understand that monopoly is not a competitive return, that if you made capitalism run the way it should run with no monopoly and just, you know, and you prevent monopoly, whether you broke up corporation or anything, to keep it so that all the factors were competitively earned, it would be a very balanced system and it would work indefinitely. Okay, so now we collect the rents and government has to disperse them, or somebody has to disperse them. Now, Joseph Stalin collected the rents and he dispersed them according to his own will. Now, I know it's being unfair here. He not only collected land rents, but he collected output from industry and so forth. He collected everything that was a surplus.
I mean, basically, all of property was owned by the government. It was, you know, the communist system is that the government controls the means of production from beginning to end. So that's not the Georgia system at all.
Why don't you explain the difference? Why, well, first of all, of course, but we still have to answer the issue. If a central group of very smart guys, for example, I appointed, and I hate to use any particular names, but let's assume I used New York investment bankers to manage this collected land rent. They could think of all kinds of things.
That's the last thing I would want to do.
Okay, to take this, create investment pools. We're going to invest over here. We're going to do that.
I mean, that would be a circular movement. You'd be taking the rent and putting it back into more private collection of rent. That would be the last thing we'd want to do.
So how would you do it then?
I would have first the government. Now, you know, some Georgians will disagree with this, but I would say if we're going to fund the government through taxation, then we should take the land rent and use that as the basis of that. And, you know, we believe that there'll be enough left over from that for some sort of a citizen's dividend. You know, for example, Alaska has the citizen's dividend from their oil riches, and I think that's about anywhere from $1,500 to $3,000 a person per year, depending on the price of oil. So we could have something like that, and it would be a consistent dividend that would go back to the people after the government has spent for all of its expenses. Now, you know, further, I would argue that we wouldn't have this kind of investment banker, you know, relationship, because there wouldn't be any need for it. If government was truly funded independently, either through land rent and or through issuing its own money via greenbacking, direct issuance, there would be no dependence on the corporations, and they would truly be able to represent the people. They wouldn't have this you know, this dependence, really, basically on the corporation to continue feeding the money.
Eliminate campaign financing privately, and that would close the loop, and you'd probably have a virtuous circle that would actually work. But the big boys in New York wouldn't be having the same amount of fun.
That's for sure.
You know, and they're living good here.
Yeah.
I mean, it's every night we go out in the town, and you know, life is good in Manhattan.
You put your finger on the reason why we don't have Georgism today. And Henry George would certainly have realized that were he to reawaken today. He would be shaking his head. He would be very disappointed. But he would understand, even from his brief 58-year lifespan, that you know, the power corrupts, and the money power and the land power are the most corrupting.
I'm going to argue for the 1% here. Okay, I'm going to say, look, the beauty of the 1% is, although it's hardening into kind of a hereditary class again, because generations can now leave money, but the argument would be, coming out of World War II up until the 1970s, there wasn't the immense amount of wealth concentrated that you see today. This is a relatively short phenomenon. And you could also argue that the people who got a lot of this wealth, and I'm thinking of George Romney as a good example, these were guys that you know, went to Harvard, met a lot of smart guys, were in the right place at the right time, and collected people of their own nature and their own understanding, and all pretty smart and capable people. And, you know, as Adam Smith said, when businessmen get together and conspire, you know, and the opportunity is right, they simply can outwit a lot of people. And as this that feeds on itself, then all the smart kids from all around the country say, hey, the opportunity is in New York or Boston. The Harvard class of half the Harvard class says, hey, I'm not going to study the classics anymore. I'm going to New York and get in on this gravy train. And you have this wealth of brains coming to one place with their levers on finance, figuring all kinds of, in effect, gambling instruments with which to separate everybody from their money. Essentially, they offer all the pension funds and so forth. Look, we can up your returns because we're pretty smart people and we figured out how to play the markets, and we'll get you a better return. So everybody, especially in a world of outsourcing, when there's downward pressure on wages, all of these funds are looking for an extra return. Now, the fact of the matter is, these people are so smart that if we looked at hedge funds as a representative sample of it, I think in the last 12 years, I was reading a statistic that they've collected over $1 trillion in fees.
Well, as a matter of fact, the top 25 hedge fund managers each make almost $1 billion a year at this point.
But let me finish the comment. They collected $1 trillion, but their investors only collected 6% of that $1 trillion. So this is a case of clever, smart people really racking it up. And of course, on the Piketty formulation, once you get a tremendous amount of capital, all the good spots to find new opportunities are yours for the asking, and the thing just multiplies.
Okay, well, I agree with you that that's the path of least resistance that people traditionally take, including the smart people. Now, the problem is that they're not producing anything. They're shifting piles of money around. They're creating, you know, phantom money, basically, or virtual money. And so what's happening is basically they're gutting the productive capacity of the nation, and they're taking away our industrial base. Michael Hudson has written about this a lot. He says we're deindustrializing America, and you know, that's the fact. They're basically you know, taking companies or leveraging them, and then they're cashing out on their assets. It's corporate rating, and now they call it private equity. So this is not a sustainable path. And I think if people realize, and I think they do realize that it's bad, but if they realize that there's another way, for example, collecting the rent on the land and having endogenous money created by the government itself for its own needs, if the people understand that the land rent is really theirs and they're giving it away, and the people who are getting it, even though they wear fancy suits and they drive around in Maseratis, have not really earned that money. They've basically stolen it. If they really understand this on a fundamental gut level, then you will have a different kind of reaction, and you have people who are electing people who want to collect the land rent, and who realize that you can have a productive and thriving economy, and in fact a better one.
What am I going to say to my little aunt living in Queens? She's got her house and it's all paid for, and you're going to come by and she has only Social Security for income, and you're going to tax the land under her house. Now, why is she going to get all excited about that?
Well, in the first place, Georgists have a answer to that, which is basically deferral. If you have somebody who is cash poor and land rich, and they've already put all their money into land, we say, well, okay, you know, they're old and they're on the end of their life. They're not going to be earning any money. They're getting a small stipend from Social Security, whatever. So we say, okay, fine. So defer the land tax until they either die or they pass that property on to somebody else, and then whoever gets that land afterward has to pay that back tax, or the estate if that person dies. So that that way you're not displacing these poor widows. It's called the poor widow syndrome.
Let me ask you, why don't you explain why it's still a private property system?
Well, we're not against private property. Georgists believe that everybody has a right to own the land legally, So your legal right is not affected. All we're asking for is the economic rent. We're not changing your rights to your land.
It's not at full value though, at least on the land part.
It's not at full value, but on the other hand, we would untax the building. So most people would find if they have a small amount of land and an efficient a building that's using it efficiently, that their taxes wouldn't go up. They might even go down.
We also say you can keep all your income and all your investment income that's invested in serious investment, not necessarily speculation. So that in effect, in addition, you get no income tax, no sales tax, no excise tax, no capital gains tax. So if you net it out, most people would be way ahead. Plus the productivity would be spread throughout the economy. The inducement to do business would just multiply. So we believe, as Georges, this has tremendous rebound effects, and it would be a system that ultimately is going to have to prevail sooner or later. Why don't you explain before we close what the Chinese are doing in that regard now?
Yeah, the Chinese have a big land bubble, and they realized this a few years ago. By the way, Michael Hudson and Ted Gwartney, who was the assessor of Connecticut, have both been active in trying to persuade the Chinese that they need to tax their land. So now they're actually starting to have a property tax. It's not a land value tax, but at least it's something to deflate that speculation in land, because especially in their cities, they've had this enormous bubble, particularly in the government headquarters, the capitals and so forth, where a lot of government officials are basically allowed to purchase land and speculate on it and make vast fortunes. So they're rolling that back. They're putting in a property tax first in the big cities, and now they're going to roll it out into the smaller cities where most of the value is. So they're going to deflate their land bubble slowly and deliberately.
Also, there were a couple of examples, small examples, in prior years of land taxing really helping economies. I believe Taiwan, Singapore, in effect, had the land tax concept, not fully but close, and those economies boomed. And even if you look at Germany, in a disguised way, they have a similar thing. They suppress speculation in land through the banking system. And the net effect is the German economy is the most productive in Europe. Scott, thank you so much for joining us on Smart Talk.
Thank you.
And that's it for this edition of Smart Talk. In upcoming shows, we will be talking to such renowned economists as Dr. David Harvey. Dr. Harvey is the Distinguished Professor of Anthropology and Geography at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. His book, The Condition of Postmodernity, published in 1989 while a professor at Oxford, was a bestseller and cited by the London newspaper The Independent as one of the 50 most important works of nonfiction to be published since 1945. Please post your questions or comments on our website at www.henrygeorgeschool.org. I'm Andrew Mazzone. We will see you again next time.